Well, as countries around the world begin passing laws to regulate big tech companies, the U.S. continues to lag behind. Misinformation on social media is rampant, including phony anti-vaccination articles and political propaganda.
But even as the falsehoods spread, Congress has yet to pass legislation holding companies accountable.
So joining us now to discuss why legislation may be more difficult to pass here in the U.S. is tech reporter for the New York Times, Cecilia Kang. Thank you so much for joining us, Cecilia. So let's talk about the conditions that are present here in the U.S. that have slowed America's ability to regulate big tech companies when we're talking about misinformation and privacy.
Yeah, the thorniest issue right now in the U.S. in terms of regulating internet companies is really about regulating speech. And the reason why that is because, first of all, we have in our law, in our Constitution, the First Amendment that protects speech from any sort of moderation or censorship from the government. And so the government is very wary of stepping in this way. So as you have countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, New Zealand, Australia, India creating or proposing laws to really curb the way that internet companies allow speech to spread that's either harmful, that incite violence, incite terrorism in some cases. The U.S. is sort of in a position where they have to abide by really our constitutional limits, and also a culture here where speech is celebrated, where there's a culture where the companies as well as citizens really value the idea that they can speak freely on the internet, even if that information is harmful. So it's a real balance here. And also the other big law that protects the internet companies is a law called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that essentially absolves all internet companies of any content that's posted on their sites that they didn't create on their own. That's a hugely powerful immunity for these internet companies that does not exist in other countries.
So, Cecilia, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg presented Congress with his own ideas of how Facebook should be regulated. But then, as you know, his own lobbyists followed up with a very different message. I'm trying to understand what happened here.
Yeah, so what happened was a few weeks ago, Mark Zuckerberg published in opinion editorials across the world, but also in the Washington Post. So his audience was very much the U.S. and lawmakers in the U.S. as well. 4 areas where he thought that the internet should be regulated. And the first was internet speech, harmful content. The second was privacy. The third was election integrity, meaning no more interference in the elections through disinformation or ads, purchases by foreign countries. And the fourth is the ability for companies to bring their, users to bring their data wherever they go. If they were to leave Facebook, they should be able to bring Facebook data to other places. The problem was the most troublesome, or the one that concerned U.S. lawmakers and regulators, was the idea of regulating speech. And immediately after Mark Zuckerberg's op-ed was published, a bunch of particularly Republican lawmakers and regulators took to the internet and said, no way, we are not in it with you, Mark Zuckerberg, on the idea of regulating speech. So quickly, Facebook's lobbyists behind the scenes had to essentially walk back some of these ideas that were presented in the opinion editorial in the Washington Post and say, actually, we don't have regulation in mind. We have more third-party help on this. We have something that's a little bit short of regulation. We, of course, do not think that we should infringe on the First Amendment here. So at this point, they've been on this spree, really, of trying to walk back Mark Zuckerberg's comments as far as speech regulation goes in the U.S. because of the same reasons that we discussed earlier. Simply, the U.S. cannot regulate content on the internet in the way that other countries can because of our First Amendment.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because you listed off other countries like the UK and Australia. I mean, these are countries that protect speech. These are countries where free speech is a value that is important to them, but they've still and they don't have a U.S. Constitution, but they still, allow people to express themselves. And they've managed to hammer out some sort of stricter list of laws. So could the U.S. possibly use some of these other countries and what they've done as a framework and then kind of like Americanize it?
Yes, there's a vast gray area between absolute right of free speech. Of course, you can't post anything illegal online, but absolute free speech rights as well. But regulating speech in a way that can at least prevent or slow down, for example, the spread of terrorist content, the spread of harmful content, bullying or harassment online. There's lots of gray area. And as of now, the internet companies are self-regulating. They are, in the U.S., they are trying to figure out on their own how they can moderate content. The thing that's really preventing the internet companies from really making very drastic decisions, frankly, is this law that we discussed earlier, CDA 230, this liability, this safe harbor that makes internet companies immune for the content that's posted on their sites that they didn't produce themselves. So that means YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snap, all these companies where their whole business is actually other people, their users posting content. They are not, these companies are not responsible for any content that's posted that from their user base that's not illegal. Of course, they need to try to rid their sites of illegal content. But even if there is illegal content, they're not necessarily held liable. In Germany, for example, they can fine up to $60,000 per incident of harmful content. We don't have in the U.S. that ability to, because of this very strong protection, CDA 230. And there's a reason why CDA 230 exists. The idea is that if people can sue constantly, and what I mean by liability is really lawsuits, law enforcement action as well as consumer lawsuits, the companies themselves will be very reluctant to allow lots of speech on their content and on their platforms that isn't policed more strongly. And that is one reason why many people, this law, CDA 230, is one reason why the authors of this law, as well as the internet companies, will say that the internet was able to thrive because it allowed speech to blossom and it allowed these companies to grow in a really unfettered way, and just with the companies moderating content on the margin. So there's a vast gray area, but on the two poles, the things that are really preventing speech regulation is the First Amendment and also this liability that's supposed to keep that keeps the internet companies from being punished strongly for content that's on their sites.
Really fascinating stuff, Cecilia. Thank you so much as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you.